Good evening, curious minds out there across the internet, and welcome to the Behind the Radio for Season 2, Episode 6, The Hidden Hand, Part 1 through 3. Well, folks, we just wrapped up our biggest, longest, and most thoroughly researched episode for sure yet. I know there was a ton of info, some of it very heavy, most of it incredibly dense. So I do truly appreciate everyone who tuned in and stuck with it all the way through to the last episode. I did my very best to at least inject a small amount of levity into that last episode whenever I thought it was appropriate. I hope that it helped somewhat to make it at least a little bit easier to get through and somewhat more entertaining. I don't feel the need to go beat for beat back through each part of the series in this BTR, because I feel like there was enough information and it was dense enough, and it's just too much material. And I know I would only be really doing it a disservice to attempt to condense all of that any more than I've already condensed it. To give a very brief summary and my personal thoughts on a few things, though, that's basically what I wanted to get done here and kind of try to get through it as quickly as I can. So we went through and broke down the true history of the real Illuminati first. I felt that that was like a pretty crucial building block to everything that we were going to talk about. I just wanted to establish a baseline and just prove that a secret society bearing that name did in fact exist throughout the late 1700s. And to give you a little insight into my logic for starting there and my thoughts, I set out wanting to tell the true story, and then how it came apart. And while the influence it likely had carried on in some ways, I wanted to show how everything after that had that name attached to it was wrongly attributed. I figured it would be pretty easy to put to bed all the conspiracies about it continuing on. And I hope that I could remove the mystique, I guess, that it has and the fear that's around it. That ended up being harder than I thought for several reasons. First was the way that the order had infiltrated Freemasonry and all the evidence that I found of its influence on higher degrees of Masonry. Also, it's impossible to tell how much the ideals and the methods of the original order went on to influence other secret societies, particularly how the order's former members went on to remain in various positions of power in those different secret societies. Also, while I researched them before, until doing the in-depth digging on Adam Weishaupt and his activities after the order was banned, I was unaware of the Saxe-Coburn-Gotha connection after he was banished, which led me down a much deeper rabbit hole regarding bloodlines and how they've maintained their power across history, that more so than even I thought that it could be, I guess. I use the term Satanic Illuminati bloodlines because that was the term used most frequently to describe them by other researchers and in the books that I had referenced for a lot of that particular info. A more accurate term, I feel, would be bloodlines of the global elite, or the global power elite, even more appropriate. While a few almost certainly have connections to Satanism or Luciferianism, and one or two have at least a tangential connection back to the Illuminati, that title really can't be applied to them all, especially with anything close to a degree of certainty. Plus, the more that we throw around those terms and use them as blanket descriptions for entire families, and we're not only tipping more and more into speculation over the facts, but the terms which can be rightfully applied in a small number of cases start to lose all of their meaning. I wanted to make this as honest and accurate of a series as possible, and not rely on salacious rumors or pure speculation at any point, because it simply isn't needed to show how inherently evil most of these people are, or how much they control of the world to this day. No wild conspiracy theory or conjecture is needed to show how old money and common interests align to form these alliances and networks, or how certain extremely wealthy individuals use their collective resources to create systems of control that mutually benefited the 1% and ensured that their legacies of money, power, and influence would continue on for generations to come. Money, not a shared belief system, is what joined many of them. While bloodlines were clearly of great importance to the nobility, it was much less of a unifying factor to the majority of the families that now control the world, like the Rothschilds, for example. While they used the nobility to help finance the start of their financial empire, they weren't born into it. It didn't make them any less powerful or influential. That being said, the satanic element couldn't be totally ignored either, because it does play a role. How big of one is kind of up for debate. I felt like the Marc Dutroux scandal was important to mention because, if nothing else, it shows just how sick and depraved some of these people really are. Whether using it to further their own gratification or simply as a blackmail instrument and a tool for control, at the end of the day, innocent children, and a countless number of them, still suffer horrible fates at the hands of these psychos. And it deserves to be brought to the light. Going through the case documents for the Dutroux case was one of the hardest, most disturbing, and most infuriating things that I think I've ever done or had to research. I did the best I could to spare you all from the truly unspeakable parts, while still hopefully shining enough light on the situation to get the point across and illustrate the reality of it all. If you still have any doubt about the information that I covered, I would invite you to look into it for yourself, but you've been warned. There are plenty of things in those documents that I really wish I could unsee, and it took me about a week to get parts of it out of my brain enough to not feel so angry or disturbed to the point that I couldn't talk about it or even do that episode. I honestly considered not even covering it, but I was afraid that it could be the difference in some people believing that these sort of things really do go on among the highest echelons of our ruling elite. The final episode was a beast. I greatly underestimated just how vast that network really was and what it would really require to fully lay it all out in any sort of a meaningful and accurate way. Even with everything that I went into in that episode, there's at least 10 times more that I just didn't have time to further research, or at least to appropriately cover, that just got left out. I hope that in the end, though, everyone was able to get something out of it and feel like they're better informed because of it, at least in some small way. The reason things are like they are, which I didn't really get into in the episode, is due to most of the population, particularly speaking about the US here, are uninformed, complacent, or just overburdened as it is, or at best don't know what to do or where to start in order to change things. That isn't by accident, though, nor is it by accident that an entire other portion of the population, we'll call them the trust the science crowd, have been so effectively conditioned to blindly trust authority regardless of any and all conflicting evidence without questioning. The reason for that is because they've been positively reinforced into that behavior since they were born and all through their education. The modern school system's job is not to truly foster wisdom or knowledge, but to reward obedience and to reinforce the call-response mechanism of just repeating what you're told by authority figures for praise and accomplishments. This is actually a long-standing approach to compulsory public education and has a long and somewhat complex history dating back to Prussia in the 1500s, actually. Our modern school system in the US, however, was largely the construction of a guy named Horace Mann and the work of John D. Rockefeller Sr., who we spoke about in our last episode as the ruthless businessman whose monopolies and underhanded tactics crushed all of his competition and ensured his fortune would continue to grow. Yeah, that guy. He joined the banking mafia later in the game, but still carved out a place there as well. Social engineering, however, was a great interest of the Rockefellers, so he would also throw his weight around in that arena as well. And it was at a time when he had become the most despised man in America, and he was desperate to use philanthropy to help rehabilitate his tarnished image, so we say. And one of those endeavors came in the form of a $1 million now this is in $1,900, mind you, grant which was used to set up the General Education Board in 1902. And this would have great power over shaping and standardizing the U.S. education system. In the South, the John F. Slater Fund for the Education of Freedmen and the Peabody Education Fund would be merged at the behest of Daniel Gilman, who was the acting trustee of both of those organizations, as well as a co-founder of the Russell Trust, with William Huntington Russell, of course, as the financial operation of Skull and Bones, which we discussed in the episode. Gilman would also become a member of the General Education Board and help Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, yes that one, of Federal Reserve fame, to pass the General Education Board charter through Congress in 1903, January 12th, I believe it to be exact. Aldrich's daughter, Abby, was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr., by the way, so just more interconnections between the families that have shaped, governed, and controlled the U.S. essentially since its inception. This charter effectively gave the Rockefellers power over not only all public schools, but all schools that provided education through the General Education Board. From there, it's a long and winding road involving psychologists, additional boards, standardized testing, and on and on. The moral of the story here is Rockefeller saw an opportunity to appear to be doing philanthropy while, in truth, simply gaining enormous amounts of influence over the U.S. education system and bending its curriculum to his will in service of corporations and big business. He wanted perfect worker bees, obedient and conditioned to serve the system without question. His $1 million initial grant would increase to $10 million in 1907, then $32 million as he continued to push his way into more schools until all totaled across later decades, the Rockefellers would grant over $7.5 billion to the board. There is a ton more to all of this, including how he would go on to influence universities, research centers, the medical field, the field of science as a whole, really. But that's all a story for another day. For now, let me just leave you with this quote from the first mission statement of the Rockefeller-endowed General Education Board. Quote, "In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present education conventions of intellectual and character education, and unhampered by tradition, we work our goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people, or any of their children, into men of learning, or philosophers, or men of science. We have not to raise up from them authors, educators, poets, or men of letters, great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, statesmen, politicians, creatures of whom we have ample supply. The task is simple. We will organize children and teach them in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing now in an imperfect way." End quote. The reason I went on this tangent about the education system is both because it relates to the elites and the control matrix, and it is a major factor in promoting groupthink, conformity, and blind obedience to the establishment and authority, which in turn makes for a large part of the population that will fight tooth and nail to help them push false narratives, suppress dissenting voices, and maintain the status quo at all costs. By fostering and reinforcing this behavior, it ensures that the masses will be less likely to come to a consensus on the severity of the issues, the necessity of changing them, or the methods to achieve it. Other factors work in tandem with that, such as poor quality of food, fluoridated water, a push by doctors to put as many people as possible on mood stabilizers, never-ending and always growing distractions, and all of it works together on an overworked, underpaid, mentally and physically exhausted population to create complacent and apathetic people susceptible to groupthink and willing to lose more and more freedom and watch conditions worsen for everyone, so long as they can just come home, eat garbage, watch TV at the end of the day, and distract themselves from the reality of their modern financial slavery. This engineered compliance, along with very strategic use of carefully orchestrated and fully contrived divisions among the masses, is exactly how things reach this dire of a point. And precisely why it is so difficult to bring people together, wake them up, or compel them to sacrifice their smaller and smaller piece of familiar comfort for the sake of making real lasting change. It's the main reason they keep us so divided. As long as we are willing to focus on one another and fight each other over crumbs, we are far less likely to notice who's sprinkling those crumbs, or just how badly we are all getting screwed. As long as we stay worried about one another and the newest boogeyman of the day, we won't come together and recognize who our shared enemy actually is, or do anything to stop them and their agenda for us. Unity, community, and compassion, not division, is our only hope of overcoming the massive alliance of big business, big government, and the banking cartel, folks. We have to vote with our money and educate others whenever possible on the reality of this situation, not in a condescending way either, just with compassion and honesty. Now that we've made it through my extended recap of the series and I've stepped back down from my soapbox for now, what do you say we get into a little bit of news real quick? The first story that I wanted to talk about is the United Nations Cybercrime Treaty. Although it's been in the works since May of 2021, most people either haven't heard about this proposed treaty or have forgot about its existence or didn't really understand the scope of it to start with. This would be the first of its kind binding UN treaty on countering cybercrime and the first instrument on a global scale to combat the ever-growing issue. On the surface, that seems, as most legislation that has come completely off the rails or been used to erode or even revoke rights and civil liberties has, to be a good and necessary step in addressing a problem that affects most, if not all of us at this point. As someone who has dealt with cybercrime on both sides of the fence in varying degrees, and certainly known many people who have been deeply affected by the issue, I'm in full support of sensible measures being taken to prosecute bad actors that are taking financial advantage of others, particularly the elderly and those with very little or limited means to combat it. The key word here, however, is sensible. This, however, after several drafts, has completely failed to clearly define its scope or put in place any kind of sufficient or meaningful safeguards preventing it from endangering human rights on or offline, or enabling repressive governments from abusing its provisions to criminalize online free speech, silence dissent, or facilitate intrusive investigations and unrestricted law enforcement access to personal systems and any and all information contained therein. This all started in 2019 when the UN passed a resolution which established an open-ended ad hoc committee and then tasked them with developing a, quote, comprehensive internal convention on countering the use of ITCs for criminal purposes. The negotiations would start in early 2022 and progress across a series of 6 sessions. 3 were to take place in Vienna, with 3 taking place in New York, and each one addressing different sections of the treaty. The final session is coming up in New York from July 29th to August 9th, and at this point, many of the issues that human rights and civil liberty protection groups have raised since the very start of this thing have yet to be corrected or even addressed. Over 100 NGOs have outlined these non-negotiable red lines in a unified open letter to the chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on Cybercrime, which it's chaired by Algeria, because the UN, the positions are done by countries or whatever. And while this all may seem unimportant to some of you, I get that. It might even kind of be difficult to truly understand without reading it. Without major changes, the draft as it now exists will further worsen disparities in human rights protections and could easily allow for increased government overreach, unchecked spying, and increased surveillance, as well as opening up access to sensitive data that will leave all of us vulnerable to privacy and data protection violations, human rights abuse, and for some, transnational repression. For example, Chapter 4 of the current draft dealing with criminal procedural measures creates a wide range of governmental powers to monitor and access people's digital systems and data, i.e. surveillance of communications data. Of course, those of us who live in America are like, so what else is new? They do this already. But under these provisions, it would go and open up monitoring, potentially to legalize it on a much larger scale than ever before. Under investigative powers, the 3 standouts are probably preservation powers, which is Article 25, production orders under Article 27, and search and seizure under Article 28. These give together a broad-reaching and not clearly defined set of powers that could easily be misused. Historically speaking, if it can be, it is very likely that it will be. These open doors for monitoring of personal devices, including on-device metadata and recordings, text, images, documents, biometric identifiers, sensor data, and so much more without falling under the legal scope of any kind of investigation. Not that any American who has been paying attention doesn't already know that the NSA already has legally utilized many of these abilities, but this would not only potentially open these abilities up and more on a global scale, but also set a legal precedent for escalating of their use. This full list of privacy concerns is far too extensive to cover in a medium like this, but I would encourage anyone who is interested to go and take a look for yourselves and maybe contact the appropriate bodies to voice your concerns about it before they get this thing finalized. I'm working on compiling a list of who to contact depending on where you are, and I will try to post those on the Facebook page in the coming week or so. Story number 2 is, are we on the brink of nuclear war? And this is a follow-up to this story, which I've covered maybe twice now, definitely one other time. And I said that I would keep you guys up to date and that I'd keep an eye on this situation. So this is some recent changes that I just kind of wanted to go over, because NATO just issued a strongly worded declaration at their Washington summit for their 75th anniversary meeting or whatever. And under Section 9 it states, nuclear deterrence is the cornerstone of alliance security, and fundamental purpose of NATO's nuclear capabilities is to preserve peace and deter aggression. As long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance, meaning essentially that all NATO member countries can and likely will, or already do, have nuclear weapons in their territories. So also saying the U.S. could use this to place its weapons in any NATO country aimed at and around Russia, which again, if you will recall, was a huge deal when Russia did just that, and that's what created the Cuban Missile Crisis. This also opens all of these countries up to Russian preemptive or countermeasures against them and those weapons. Bear in mind that the U.S. also has bioweapons and development facilities in Ukraine, and has since before the Russian quote-unquote offensive started. Let us not also forget that aside from the CIA coup that originally brought Ukraine under our effective control, and the intentionally tanked peace talks by the U.S. and Britain, it was NATO encroachment and intervention that truly began this entire proxy war. NATO would go on to cite China, Iran, and Russia as reasons that NATO must maintain and potentially deploy nuclear armaments, as they are a, quote, a cause for profound concern. Going on to say, quote, we are confronted by hybrid cyber, space, and other threats and malicious activities from state and non-state actors. Interesting that they mentioned space there. Apparently NATO's in space or going to space. That's something I wasn't aware of. And Russia has already effectively thrown down the gauntlet, stating plainly that NATO shouldn't go too much further with military support of Ukraine, lest it risk a conflict with Russia that could, quote, quickly turn nuclear. It almost feels like those in power either want or need that outcome at this point. It would seem Ukraine has become bigger than just a place to launder billions and cook up bioweapons, and is rapidly becoming a launching pad for the order out of chaos needed to establish some sort of global governance. Just some food for thought. I'll continue to keep you updated as the situation develops, as always. But it just kind of struck me as interesting and concerning, and yeah, there's definitely a higher likelihood, I would say, for some sort of nuclear conflict on a global scale at this point in history, possibly than any other time, definitely outside of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I would advise everyone to keep an eye on it. There are some, minor safeguards that you can take, especially if you live in an area that would be a high value target, put it that way. There are certain facilities around you that would be great for another country to strike. Then I would look into what you can do to prevent radiation sickness, and as best you can isolate your home. And I'll leave it at that, because that's about all the scary nuclear talk I can handle, and I'm sure you don't want to hear any more either. And our final story this evening is something that I titled The Coming Storm. I feel that I've never taken any joy in being the bearer of bad news. When I post or write or talk about things that I feel are negative or depressing, I'm doing so because I feel they are important, and in the hopes that by bringing some of these matters to light, I can potentially help somebody make the best decision or prepare for what is coming. When I make a prediction or talk about things that I've uncovered ahead of the news cycle, I don't do so in hopes of later saying, look, I told you so, or just to be a doomsayer or a fearmonger. And I always would prefer and hope that I turn out to be wrong. I'm perfectly okay with being wrong. It's definitely preferable to the outcomes that I see ahead. Whenever possible, I also try to present alternatives or solutions to the problems that I present. I also fully understand that we all have enough worries and troubles in our lives these days without having to think about the truth of the world, the deep corruption of our systems of government and finance, or worry over potential events and outcomes that haven't yet come to pass anyway. So I sincerely, deeply appreciate all of you for tuning into these BTRs and staying to hear the news portion and listening to the main podcast in general. With all of this in mind, though, something has been weighing on me for a while now. Something that I've held off on discussing on here in full, but that I don't want to risk not talking about it as the signs and indications of it being a reality continue to grow and seem to become more evident by the day. I think that at this point, most people, definitely the vast majority of you out there listening right now, have been sensing that something bad is coming, that something is about to break within the U.S. economy or our political system, and likely the world as a whole. With ever-growing tensions around the world, many instigated by the U.S. desire to control and meddle in the affairs of other countries and act as a sort of de facto world police, but of course solely in its own self-interest, while insisting, of course, that it's rooted in some variety of noble intention, moral obligation, or that long-running joke of an excuse that we have to, quote, defend democracy. In truth, we are currently goading at least 3 members of BRICS nations, which I've been warning about for some time, and is in reality a major threat, regardless of how deserved it might be, to our economy and global hegemony as a whole, into some sort of an armed conflict via 3 separate proxy wars. We've got Russia via Ukraine, and increasingly we have China via Taiwan and Iran via Israel and its surrounding interests in the region. Add to it the fact that the military-industrial complex seems hell-bent on stirring conflict, selling arms, and otherwise justifying further increased funding by any means necessary, guided by the global elite, which already seem determined to reduce the world population one way or another, and it starts to paint a fairly grim picture full of disturbing potential outcomes. Getting back to what I was saying, though, that ever-present feeling of the other shoe dropping, if you will, is seeming less and less a needless anxiety and more a justified warning coming from our collective consciousness. Like I said, I truly don't want to needlessly fearmonger. And there's no way to tell what the future holds. And I always try to focus and hope for the best outcome for us all. I do, though, before we end this evening, just want to go over a few things that I personally feel are strong indicators of a coming storm that we shouldn't obsess over, but should definitely reasonably prepare for just in case. Here's some things without going into super deep details that give me the feeling that the U.S. could be about to go through, at bare minimum, a very rough patch, possibly even a full-on depression, and potentially, if not corrected massively in time, possibly a total collapse and devaluation of the U.S. dollar. For starters, as has become the ever-present trend, the U.S. spends far more yearly than it takes in from taxes, and usually 30% or more of that goes just to service our massive debt, it's currently on track to become the U.S.'s single biggest expense before the end of this year, which is absolutely insane when you consider just how much we actually spend on defense and our military, and that we funnel into other countries like Ukraine and Israel. Next, the situation I've discussed several times on here already, The potential upcoming collapse of the commercial real estate market is on the verge of being compounded by what would, by all indications, be a similar situation in the housing market. A massive housing bubble has developed, especially here in the southern states, where demand shot sky high during the scamdemic because we had basically a migration of people from other places. Since they were now able to work from home, they started seeking cheaper housing. If you can work from everywhere, why not do it somewhere where you've got a lower cost of living and your mortgage isn't as high? So we had tons of people move here. And so that caused the builders and the realty people and all that to start producing a whole lot of houses. But as the trend of people moving in slowed down lately, builders kept working. These giant realty conglomerates and the wealthy have continued to build at the same rate that they were before. So supply has kind of quickly overtaken demand, and it's caused home prices to forcibly drop in a lot of places. With the interest rates remaining high, however, and many people refusing to finance a new home at these rates, even the lower prices, albeit still greatly inflated when you compare those to pre-scamdemic levels, are not enough to really stimulate the market and get people buying again. These are similar and worse, even by most metrics, conditions to what we saw in August of 2006 before that massive crash happened. Just going by the numbers of available homes for sale versus demand for new homes, interest rates notwithstanding in this, it's even higher than it was then. While, granted, watching those who have profiteered off of others for the last 4 years and jacked prices up through the roof in rent and housing, finally losing their asses in the most satisfying comeuppance in recent memory, is going to be amazing to witness. And the prospect of housing possibly being more affordable finally, once that all levels out, would be great. The potential wave of defaults that follows, though, combining with the already occurring defaults of the commercial market, may prove fatal to many banks, though, especially the smaller ones. Then, there's, as previously discussed, the ever-present threat of the gold-backed BRICS currency displacing the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Considering the perceived value of the US dollar now hinges completely on maintaining that position, this alone would completely devalue the dollar and destroy our economy. The more the US makes enemies around the world and runs them into the arms of BRICS, and the less effective that our protection racket appears to current allies, the more realistic this potential outcome becomes. Also, we have companies going bankrupt and going out of business at rates that haven't been seen since the Great Depression. That number continues to rise. We've seen more bank failures. That number seems to continue to ramp up. These are really not good indicators of the health of our economy overall, and definitely things that we have to at least keep an eye on and try to stay ahead of. And finally, as the Fed continues to raise interest rates and as inflation keeps rising, realty markets seem to be headed for a major crash. Those markets cause more bank failures. The Fed prints off more money from nothing at ever-increasing rates so that the government can turn around and give it away to other countries and start wars, thus further driving inflation. And a rising inflation reduces the profits of companies as consumer demand also drops due to the pricing increases, causing companies to lay off more and more people. You can easily see how, without major and immediate action, the empire is headed into a long-denied death spiral of a crash, and looking more and more like we are following the playbook of the Roman Empire every single day. There are way more factors, both for and against this, I'm sure, than I could ever hope to lay out here in this. And there's no way to tell for certain how a vast majority of all of this is really going to play out. So there's always still hope until there isn't. I just fear that at that point it will develop so quickly from there that there's not going to be any time to really prepare. If I were you, though, and disclaimer here, I am not qualified to give financial advice, and that certainly isn't what this is. I'm simply saying that I personally wouldn't be keeping all of my money in a bank or in the stock market or in real estate right now, for that matter. I don't want to tip any further towards this being financial advice, but I've discussed alternatives in the past some, and I would also encourage you to at least research some other alternative investments and wealth storage options, just in case. Hopefully conditions shift and everything works out fine. That's always what I'm pulling for. I'm not a psychic, and I have no way of truly knowing what's around the corner, guys. It's just been on my heart, and I needed to bring this all up. I would rather be safe than sorry, on the off chance that I might possibly help even one of you out there by saying this stuff. And I'll be back with you all next week, hopefully, or at worst, the following Wednesday, I guess, with a more lighthearted and fun episode. Okay, I'm trying to make up for all this heavy stuff that we've been discussing. I followed up a very heavy series, a 3-parter, super dense, with this, which has been pretty heavy and super dense to some degree. So I want to do something a little more fun next week. So please don't be put off by all of this and come back for that, because I think that you're going to have a good time with that one. In the meantime, go make friends with your neighbors. Start coming together as a community. Discuss starting a neighborhood co-op, some sort of growing food, or another mutually beneficial kind of idea that's not dependent on having a good economy or a caring or functioning, for that matter, government or supply chain. Do what you can for the homeless in your area and support your local animal shelters. Please, they're all struggling right now. Do what good you can, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And try to embody whatever change that it is that you want to see in this world. It's cliche, but it's true. The more you do, the more you inspire others to do more. So I promise you that it will at least lift and cleanse your spirits and your soul. And I think that we could all use a little bit more of that right now. Thank you, as always, for joining me. I'd love to know what you guys thought about the Hidden Hand series. So please, if you can, take just a second. Leave me just a few words in the Q&A, or you can drop a voicemail on Spotify. It's super easy, super quick, and I love getting those, so it really does mean a lot. And I truly care about what all of you like or don't like. I try to take that into account and use that to make better episodes for you. So I appreciate and love all of you guys, and I will talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.